The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 4th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So some of you may know that the week before this past week, I was away out of state attending a continuing education class. It was a class that was called Executive Skills for Church Leaders. And it was this week-long intensive that took principles that are normally associated with the business field and applied them to how we can be church together. It took a look at topics like marketing, leadership, finance, entrepreneurship, organizational mission, and those kinds of things, all packed into 4.5 days. I can tell you're jealous, right? I have pages and pages and pages of notes that I'm going to have to digest here soon in the next few days and weeks, but the basic message that I took away from it, and the reason that I'm kind of pulling back the curtain onto what I was doing then, is a message for me, one, as a leader, to be able to answer for myself the questions of who am I, and what are my values as a pastor and as a person, but then also for us as a church to answer the questions of who are we, and why are we doing what we do here, and why do we have to offer, or what do we have to offer to each other and to the world? Easy enough, right? Questions I think we've talked about before, but and always dug into a little bit. But really think about it, whether it's in a church or in a business or in any of our daily lives, aren't those good questions to be able to answer? Wouldn't the answers to those questions make for good guiding principles to help shape this work that we do? I mean, if you don't believe me, just take another look at today's gospel story, because it seems like that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. And he didn't even have to go to that class. So I think we first should take a look as to how we've gotten to this point in Luke's gospel, because here we are halfway through chapter 4, and we are just now hearing the very first words from Jesus that he speaks as part of his public ministry. I mean, up to this point, we've been hearing about his birth story and John's birth story. We hear about Jesus being named and going to the temple, and we hear about John going to the wilderness to proclaim this baptism, and then we hear Jesus being baptized, and then he goes to the wilderness, and suddenly he comes out of the wilderness, and the first thing he does is go to the synagogue. He goes there to worship, and he's called up to read from the scrolls. This is the first thing that Luke tells us that he does. And I'm sure we know that these stories are different, depending on which gospel we read. Last week we heard of Jesus' first story according to John, which was of course, changing the water into wine. So that was John's take. That was John's angle on what he wants to portray Jesus and who Jesus is. That sign for John was this launching point into Jesus' ministry. So today we're hearing from Luke that Luke believes this is what's important, that Jesus fulfills this prophecy that we hear in Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. We're in a season of these aha moments, right? Every week since Christmas, since the Christmas season ended, we've been in Epiphany, hearing story after story of who Jesus is, who the wise men went to see, who was claimed by God in his baptism, who performed that miracle of changing water into wine. And now this prophecy, a prophecy that is revealed to us. God's anointed one who has come to bring freedom to those who have never experienced freedom before. God's anointed one who has come to bring healing and wholeness to anyone who has not felt complete. God's anointed one who has come to proclaim this completely new life through God. It's an old prophecy, one that everyone who was present in the synagogue that day hearing it had heard plenty of times before in their lives of faith. But it was in that moment, on that day, when Jesus turns the table on them. Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Jesus came to be that fulfillment of the prophecy. Jesus came to show us that what was predicted in the scriptures has come true. I imagine that between all of us here, we would have many different answers to that question of who is Jesus and why did he come into the world. But I wonder if any of our answers would include this portion of Luke's gospel. I mean, do we talk about being released from captivity or freed from oppression from what Jesus has done for us? It feels kind of foreign to us to say that. You know, we rarely describe our situation, unless we're reading it from the Confession and Forgiveness like we did at the beginning of the service, as being captive to sin. You know, later in John's Gospel, and we'll hear Jesus telling his disciples that the truth will set them free, and they say, well, we've never been slaves to anyone. How could we be free if we're free already? I mean, this is not our normal point of view. I was watching TV the other night, and an interview with this guy came on, and he had just been released from prison after 20 years. And he was describing this re-entry process for him back into the real world. And it was something that as he was describing it, I realized I never thought much about. But think about it, in 20 years, think about how much cars have changed. Think about how much the technology in our houses have changed in 20 years. Think about what it means to be able to set your own schedule again and do your own thing after 20 years. It was just a few weeks after he had gotten out, and he said he's already gained 10 pounds. But he was describing what it literally meant to be set free after having been captive or imprisoned for so long. His entire world had changed, and his entire worldview has changed from his experience as well. I mean, how often do we keep those kinds of experiences kind of out at arm's length? Or those types of people out at arm's length? You know, the stuff that we hear about and that we see on the news always seems separate from us until it's not. I'm sure maybe you've heard of this partial government shutdown we had for a little while. It was on the news everywhere. It was on our Facebook feeds. I saw so many friends who had been affected by it or had family affected by it. But still, it was always out there. It was always separate. But then the other week when I traveled for my class and I had to go to the airport and I had to encounter all those TSA agents that I kept hearing about on the news and kept hearing about that they were working without pay and you better get there early because they may not even be working. Well, suddenly when I was walking in, I had a different outlook on this situation. And then when I encountered them, I think I may have looked at them for the first time. Normally you go into the airport, you just go. These people are here to hold you up, just do their job, just go. But suddenly, I was thinking about them differently. I was looking at them, and they had smiles on their faces, believe it or not. They were people who were trying to keep us safe, not just someone who wanted to root through our bags. Hearing these kinds of stories, experiencing these types of people changed my outlook and my worldview. And I wonder if that same thing can happen when we hear from Luke's gospel about what Jesus has come to do. This work is utterly life-changing, as hopefully we know. This person of Jesus has captured the attention of so many people who have begun to follow him just to see what he was going to say or do or teach next. We even hear in Luke's gospel here that he was praised by everyone as he was teaching in the synagogue. But we're soon going to find out, spoiler alert, that is quickly going to change. In the very next verses that we'll hear next week, this changes quickly. The message that Jesus is proclaiming becomes so life-altering that people want nothing to do with it. But now, today, in this moment, I wonder if we can think about that question of what this mission, what Jesus came for, what that means for us. When we think about who we are, who we are called to be as followers of Jesus, is our outlook changed because we know this prophecy from Isaiah has been fulfilled? When we think about who we are called to be as the church in this place, as St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Colcamp, Missouri, does our mission, does whatever we do point to this good news for the poor that Luke tells us shapes who Jesus is? When we walk into this annual meeting in just a couple hours, will the things that we discuss and the things that we end up voting on, will those speak to the mission of Jesus that help proclaim release to those who feel captive to the weights of this world? What does this prophecy and this fulfillment of prophecy, this fulfillment of these scriptures mean for us? Now that we are learning more and more about who Jesus is and what he's come for, what's next? That's our question. And so I want to end today with a poem that I came across that speaks to this. It's called The Work of Christmas by Howard Thurman. And while we are far away from Christmas, I think this still speaks to where we are. And the poem reads, "When the song of angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flocks, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among the people, to make music in the heart." Amen.